Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. We will start the webinar in a minute or two. We'll just let people join. We still see people coming in. Thank you. Okay, let's get started. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining the Research Data Alliance webinar on data description outputs. It's great to see we have about 40 people attending the webinar, so that's wonderful. My name is Stephanie Kittas. I'm the RDA Director of Operations, and together with my colleague Bridget Walker from the RDA Secretariat, I'll be moderating today's webinar. First of all, thanks again for joining us. We want to share with you an overview of some of the outputs implemented through RDA groups and provide you the opportunity to have a chat with our speakers. Prior to getting started, a little bit of housekeeping. First of all, you have joined the webinar in listen-only mode, so you're muted. Please submit questions to us via the questions box, which is located in the lower half of the GoToWebinar interface. If you type in a question, we'll be able to see it and we can respond to it. We plan to have questions after each speaker's presentation, but please feel free to type in your question at any time. And in case we're unable to answer all the questions coming in, we'll definitely follow up with you offline. Also, we're recording the presentation and the link to the recording and the slides will be posted within the next day or so. So, as you probably know, this session is part of RDA's Global Adoption Week, which aims to demonstrate the wide variety of RDA adoptable and adopted solutions to data sharing challenges that people in the field encounter in their daily jobs. This was originally planned for the plenary 15 that didn't happen in its physical form due to COVID. So this is the agenda for this session. So we have 3 presentations and I will introduce the first speaker in a minute. But before I do, we'd like to conduct a short poll. And I will have to change my slide. Okay. If you could please go to the Slido page and type in W342 as the code, that would be wonderful. And we have 3 questions there for you. So question number 1 is, what is your primary role? Are you a researcher, research support staff, project manager, IT specialist, or other? Okay, looks like we have a good mix. Okay, about as many research support staff as we have researchers and other combined. Not quite. Okay, thank you very much. Let's go to the second question. What's your primary domain? So if you could again select which one applies. Okay, we don't have anyone from the medical or health sciences. And nobody from agricultural sciences. Okay. And more than a third domain agnostic. Okay. Now, the next question is a little bit more free-form. If you have one question or issue related to data description RDA outputs that you would like to learn more about today, if you would like to let us know what that is, that would be useful. Admittedly, it's a little bit of an open-ended question. Not really, okay. Okay, so versioning of DOI, best practice for data from the long tail of research. How do we train and reach more researchers? Okay. How to encourage adoption. Different vocabs. Okay, well, thanks for that. And if you have any further questions that you would like us to know about, please contact us by email afterwards. Okay, thank you very much. Connecting across repositories. Okay. So, without too much further ado, let's go to today's speakers. So, our first presenter is Jens Klump from the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organization, or CSIRO, in Australia. Jens is a geochemist by training, and his field of research is the application of information technology to geology. His work on research data infrastructures led him to investigate the change of digital objects over time and to asking the question what we mean when we speak about versioning of data. And I shall make Jens presenter. Okay, Jens, over to you.
I hope it's showing the screen now.
Yes, I can see it.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Stephanie, for the kind introduction and for the fluid disentangling of CSIRO. And sorry about that. Sorry about that. Let's get started. So I'll briefly want to talk to you about data versioning and the outcomes of the data versioning working group and what we might see as adoption and next steps. The question, as Stephanie already said, that I asked what do we mean by versioning? So one of the things that we all know is that data sets published on the web may change over time. And the reasons why they change differ. Sometimes data sets are updated on a scheduled basis, and other data sets are changed because there are improvements in collecting the data that make updates worthwhile. Sometimes data need to be changed because errors are found. And in order to deal with these changes, new versions of data sets may be created. But what the term version doesn't tell us is what is the significance of the change? And if there is a change, is this new version compatible with previous versions? And a couple of other questions that we might ask too. We collected quite a number of use cases over the lifetime of the working group. And from analyzing the use cases, we distilled a handful of what we call data versioning principles. So there's the principle of version control, which we labeled revision. So each time you change something, it does create a new revision of the data set. But that doesn't tell you about the significance. It only tells you something has changed. Then we look at data production, which is more of an editorial process where we decide to release a data set, a new version. And in this process, we need to communicate the significance of the change. And then other things that come into this areas, then objects in granular collections. So objects can be grouped into collections and time series, and there are also ideas of how to identify these collections as collections of objects, time series, or aggregates. And then we came across something that was around, I will explain that in a moment, that sometimes it is the same data in terms of content, but it comes in a different format, something that we call a manifestation of a data set. So it's a way to identify different formats of what is essentially the same work. And then we also look at derived products, so what is also known as provenance. This is information about how this object was derived from a precursor object. In our work, we applied the functional requirements for bibliographic records, FURBA for short, and this very busy diagram gives an overview of applying these principles to data products derived from the ASTER satellite mission. Whatever the ASTER satellite mission is, that's not important now, but what we derive from the FURBA framework is that the mission as such is the work. And this work is then expressed through a series of data products. In this case, it had to go through quite a number of processing steps to get to the published data products that we talk about in this example. And here we have 14 products published in one series, 3 in another one. So 17 in total, 7 different expressions of this work. And these are then manifested in different formats, here labeled BSQ, GeoTIFF, and NetCDF, telling you that it's essentially the same data, content, but expressed in a different format. And then these manifestations are stored as files, as items in different places at Geoscience Australia, the State Geological Surveys, the CSIRO data portal, and others. And I refer you to the final report to learn more about the detail of what that means. This final report and community review was published early this year and ran through a community review period in February 2020. At the end of the review period, we had 1,865 views of the document. It's 3,500 roughly by today. And we've received 2 comments in writing and some in-person feedback that was incorporated into a revised version of the report that is now online. The final report and the data versioning principles are based on a collection of 39 use cases that were contributed by members of the community. And these use cases are current practices from data providers, which we then use to analyze and distill the principles from. But we also registered the use cases with the RDA use case group for future work in other groups. So other RDA groups can refer to our use cases and see if there's something that they can extract from them for their work. An issue that came up after we had published the final version of the review, just in the run-up to the plenary, was a new question about mirroring data and republishing data that has already been published. So at the virtual plenary, we ran a late-breaking session, Birds of a Feather meeting called Data Republication and Duplication, Authority, Identity, Ethics. And the idea here was that research data in digital form can be easily copied, stored in multiple places, and republished through more than one repository or service. But how can humans and machines know whether they are accessing an authoritative copy of the data? How can the authoritative source, in this often a data center, be attributed or acknowledged when these data are mirrored on a different site? Who gets the credit for the used and cited data? Do we need to rethink data licensing? And what needs to be replicated in order to preserve the quality standards of the original data? We had two very lively discussions around that and collected quite a lot of material that we still need to process and incorporate this into future incarnation of the data versioning group. So this session is about adoption, and with the final report published, we are looking forward to feedback from the community. What we would like to hear is, did we miss a use case? Are the data versioning principles applicable to your use case? What kind of guidance would you need to implement the data versioning principles? These are things we would love to hear from you about. The next steps we are debating at the moment. The data versioning working group has ended. And so the question is now, what do we do next? Do we go into maintenance mode or not? Should we work as a different or in a different working group or form an interest group? So options are that we continue as an interest group to work on the new topics that arose, like the data republication question, that we collect adoption cases and we develop recommendations, not just principles, but recommendations on data versioning practices from the data versioning principles. So thank you for listening, and thank you to all those who contributed the 39 use cases that we used in the working group and all of you who joined the discussions. And thank you to the RDA Secretariat and Tab Liaison, Stephanie Ketters and Tobias Weigel for their guidance and support. And above all, we would like to thank the Australian Research Data Commons for their support. And please check out the report and the use cases in the RDA Zenodo community. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Jens. May I just remind everybody, if you have questions for Jens, please type them into the questions panel. And if you hear hammering noises, that's my neighbor getting work done on her house. I apologize. Okay, we had a question earlier, just not on any presentation, but just to repeat, we will record all these sessions of the Global Adoption Week, and the recordings will be made available probably about a day or so after each session. Okay, I don't see any questions so far. Okay, any thoughts on how to identify versions? For example, each version its own DOI?
That could be something. One of the questions that we were asked in the review period was whether we could be less vague in our principles, but the problem is that, of course, it depends a lot on your workflows and your community in your repository. And if it is important to identify each and every version, yes, definitely use a DOI for every one of them. Please distinguish, though, between, are you talking about revisions or releases? And I would certainly recommend using DOI for new releases, the outcome of an editorial process. Whether you use DOIs for every single revision is a different matter. That depends on the needs of your community, whether it is necessary to be able to go to exactly that one release, and whether it has to be through this technical mechanism or whether there are alternatives. But certainly on the matter of dataset releases after an editorial process, identifying them with their individual DOIs would be the best practice.
Okay, thank you, Jens. Okay, there's another question. When submitting a dataset to a repository, how do you distinguish between a new version or a new dataset record? What are the requirements for a version? So what are the requirements for a version?
This goes back again to this distinction between the revision and the release. And in a revision tells you that something has changed. You compare the bit stream and it looks different, or you look at the checksum, it looks different. So that tells you something has changed, but it doesn't tell you about the significance of that change. And that significance is, again, something that relates to the community practices, the reuse, and to your editorial processes. So as a repository, you have to be clear about what you want to communicate to your designated user community about the significance of the change. And in our final report, we describe a couple of ways to do that. The most popular one is semantic versioning, where the numbering scheme conveys a notion of the significance of the change, whether, for instance, a change is backward compatible, whether it is likely to break your workflows or not, or whether this is just a minor correction.
Okay, thanks. There's a slightly longer question, and that will have to be the last one that we answer here. Any other questions, please still type them in, but we'll have to get back to you offline, I think. So great work. How to reconcile it with, for example, the DCAT model with conceptual data sets, work in FRBR, and different distributions, manifestations or expressions. DCAT, for example, used the RDA machine actionable DMP common standard. DCAT used, for example, in the RDA machine actionable DMP common standard.
I would have to look into that in detail to be able to answer that question.
Okay.
Sorry, I can't do that right now.
That's fine. So thank you for asking that question, and we'll get back to you offline after the session at some point, if that's okay. All right. Thank you very much, Jens. And
thank you.
Thank you very much. And we shall now go to our second speaker, or rather speakers in this case. And I shall just make Lauren the presenter. So our next speakers are Lauren Gawne, Andrea Berez-Kroeker, and Helene Andreassen. Lauren is a lecturer in linguistics at Latrobe University in Australia. She works on the documentation of Tibetan languages in Nepal and the use of gesture in conversation as well as online communication. Andrea is an associate professor in the Department of Linguistics at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Andrea is a documentary linguist specializing in endangered language preservation with a focus on linguistics, archiving, technology, and community language activism. And Helene is the head of library teaching and learning support in the Culture and Social Sciences Library at the Arctic University of Norway. Helene is a linguist with research interests in French phonology and phonological variation. And all three are co-chairs of the Linguistics Data Interest Group, and we'll talk about their output. So thank you very much. Lauren, I think your slides are there, but not in presentation mode.
Okay, let's see. Still, every time I think I have the hang of this thing, something new and exciting happens. So what are we looking at here?
You might have to press present next to share, but I don't know.
Yeah, I'm just in the wrong window.
Fair enough.
I do normally know how this works. Let's see. Well, here are the Tromsø recommendations that we'll be talking about today, just while I try and figure out where my screen has gone. No, I don't want to share. Sorry.
So
Here we go.
Just for everyone, there's a handout attached to this webinar, which is the PDF of the recommendation of the output. So thanks,
Thank you,
Lauren.
Stephanie.
Go ahead.
I'm here with my co-chairs, Andrea and Helena. This is the Linguistic Data Interest Group is very much a team project, so I'm delighted that the three co-chairs of the team can be here today to discuss this. I will be giving an introduction to linguistic data so that you can understand kind of the motivation behind the Tromsø recommendations. And then Andrea will be talking about our current work, which is building support and uptake in creating better data citation practices in linguistics. So in the survey Stephanie ran at the start of this webinar, I'm sure a number of the linguists said that they were social scientists, and a number of them said that they were in the humanities. Broadly speaking, linguistics is the study of human language, and our methodologies straddle kind of both of those traditions, but is essentially a data-driven social science in that we use linguistic data to draw inferences about cognition and about culture and social structures. So our primary data is kind of recordings of language use in its various manifestations.
Lauren, sorry to interrupt.
That's okay.
Sorry, you're still not in presenter mode, so we're just seeing the title slide.
Okay, I'm sorry. This is frustrating in that it is in presenter mode, but what I'm going to do is unshare my screen. Sorry about this. I think I figured out what's happening. And then I just need to figure out how to share another window.
If you click on the top bar sharing, the little triangle, it should actually let you pick different screens if you have different screens.
Thank you. Yes. I'll just show my main screen, and everyone can now see the horror that is my desktop. Hurrah. That's better?
We can see background what is linguistics now.
Yes. Okay, good. I will continue to work in this semi-presenter mode. Okay, so linguistics is a combination of recordings of language, and then annotations of these recordings are part of the analysis as well. And I had a lot of sympathy for the person who was asking about long-tail data, because language is wonderfully varied in all its manifestations, and that means that there is also a great heterogeneity in linguistic data, and trying to find a way to talk to all linguists in the broadest possible way about data citation is a fun and interesting challenge when you consider that we have primary recordings of video or audio of linguistic data. We have written examples of linguistic information, often marked up with translations, and here we also have an interlinear gloss that explains what is happening in the original language structure. We can have primary acoustic data. Here we have a spectrogram and a waveform, and you can see in this software we also have the annotation of that primary data. And then we have experimental or statistical data from corpora as well. So there's a great variety in the different types of data that linguists use. Even though there's a great deal of variation, one thing that is pretty consistent is that there is no strong tradition of data citation in linguistics. This is some work that we did looking at the data citation practices in linguistics. We see an incredible variation in the type of data, but fully over 50% of data examples aren't cited to a primary source. So we can assume that they were collected by the linguist publishing the paper, or the linguists publishing the paper, but there's no citation to an underlying data source. Another 25% will have some kind of standard citation, often in APA format, to a primary data source, and this is some kind of secondary analysis of that data. And then a wonderful, amazing long tail of varied practices, sometimes codes to corpora, sometimes just a title. This kind of vague linking makes it very hard to reproduce research and find the original data. And it's linked to a lot of other research practices in terms of sharing primary data or making primary data available that the Linguistic Data Interest Group is interested in as well. So because we saw a real gap in how linguistic data was cited and a need to build a cultural awareness around the importance of primary data in research transparency, the Linguistic Data Interest Group was formed in 2017. You can see from our page on the RDA website the Austin Principles of Data Citation, which was one of our first publications that shared the kind of motivation for making data available. And then the next step was the creation of the Tromsø recommendations that Andrea will now talk about, which is looking specifically at formats for data citation.
Okay, thanks, Lauren. Can you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. Okay, so yeah, so as Lauren said, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Tromsø recommendations for citation of research data in linguistics. The reason the document has this name is because we completed drafting the document when we were together in Norway last year. So basically what the recommendations are is a citation model for in-text citations and bibliographic references. In other words, we want this document to teach researchers how to create good citations for the data that they use in their publications. We have commented examples in the recommendations and also elaborated definitions. The document was created over the course of, I'd say, a little more than a year. We mostly did this through asynchronous meetings of the entire LDIG membership, and you can see in the images on this slide that we did that in Google Docs. We also invited input from people that we were calling VIPs. So these are editors and publishers of linguistics journals, and also some prominent people in our field who are interested in data issues. And we also had a couple of in-person meetings. A group of authors met together in Philadelphia in conjunction with the RDA plenary that was held there, and then also in Norway last year. And the intended audience of this document is editors of linguistic publications. Our hope is that they will adopt the recommendations into their style sheet. Also, of course, linguistic researchers are our primary audience because we want them to be able to figure out how to create good citations for their data, and then also repositories who can use the recommendations as guidelines for displaying and collecting metadata. Next slide, please. Okay, so we'll try to take a look at the Tromsø recommendations in just a minute, but what you'll see is that what we've created is a series of templates. So we have minimal templates and expanded templates for in-text citations and for bibliographic references. We also take time in the recommendations to highlight issues that are, in particular, important to linguistic data. So an example of that is that in many language communities, especially indigenous language communities or endangered language communities, providing linguistic data is an act of expertise. And so we need a way to be able to recognize that expertise in a citation. So we have a good discussion about the various roles that can be possible in a citation where we can give credit to speakers or signers of language data. We also provide explanation of all the elements in the template in very clear terms. We want it to be a user-friendly document, and we have examples from real linguistic data. I was going to ask Lauren to try to put the recommendations up on the screen, but I think with the screen sharing issues, it's probably, oh, you did it, great, fantastic. Okay, so you can also get this document. It's a handout in the GoToWebinar control panel. But Lauren, if you want to just scroll down a little bit. Thank you. Yeah, you can see that on the next page, we start with an executive summary. Yeah, right there. Okay, and you can see in the summary, we've got the template. So if you look there, that top green template there, that's the minimal bibliographic reference. So basically the minimal template for things that show up in the bibliography. It has to have an author, a date, a title, a publisher, and a locator. And these terms are all defined in the document. And then we also have below that an expanded reference where you can add some additional elements like other attribution and version and date access. Yeah, and then you can also see we've got the template there for an in-text citation. Yeah, if you go down a little bit further, where we start to talk about, yeah, maybe stop right on the next page in section 1.3.1. Yeah, you can see we give examples of data sets. So this one right here, example 1. This is meant to be a straightforward example for readers of the document. So this is an actual data set. Alexander Adelar is a real person. And this is a collection of stories in the Ma'anyan language that are held in a repository called Paradisec, and you can see the DOI there. And so we won't go through the rest of this today, but you can scroll through it and you'll see that we have lots and lots of examples of real data. We try to come up with as many different cases of different types of data, different exceptions, different conditions to help the reader of this document really select the best situation for the data that they want to cite. Okay. All right, you can go back to the slides when you're ready. Thank you. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so the calendar for dissemination, right? As I mentioned, in November of last year, we finalized the document. In January of this year, it underwent the community review process. In February, we published it as a supporting output. And then our plan was to spend a few months really spreading the word to the community about this. We were going to present at the plenary in Melbourne. We were going to start talking to linguists and publishers and repositories to try to get the word out. But as you know, of course, we were not able to do that because of the pandemic. And so now we're in a position, now that it's June, trying to figure out how to get the word out in a time when everyone's mind is on other things right now. So next slide, please. Okay, and so we actually have another asynchronous meeting going on right now. And what we're doing is asking our internal community how the best way to get the message out to researchers and repositories and publishers would be. But we actually have a question for you, the audience of this webinar today. If you guys have ideas about the answers to these questions, we'd love to hear it. And so, has your group had success with output adoption? Are there stakeholders that we're missing? So if you guys have any ideas about how we might get linguists excited about this document, we'd love to hear it. You can let us know in the questions function here, or you could also email the group. Lauren's given her address there. Okay. All right, I think that's it. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Lauren, Andrea, and Helene. If there are questions from the audience, please type them into the questions box. We haven't gotten any yet, but it just occurred to me, have you actually also spoken to the data versioning group?
We have not, but I was just thinking about that tonight. Yeah.
So that might be an idea.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you.
Is versioning an issue in linguistic data? I mean, this is probably too broad a question, but even though I actually have a linguistics degree myself, I never worked as a linguist, so I don't really know.
Well, yes. I mean, I think so. Yeah. So it's usually what we have is one person or a small group of people working on a data set, and it's often the case that as time goes on, the annotation of the recordings will be enhanced, so more and more information will be added. So yes, it is common to have multiple versions of data.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. There are currently no questions, so I would propose we move on to the third speaker. And if anyone has any more questions for Andrea, Helene, and Lauren, please feel free to type them in, and we'll either get back to them at the end of the session or offline. Okay, thank you very much. And I shall now make Amir the presenter.
Thanks, Stephanie.
Okay, so our third and final speaker is Amir Aryani from the Swinburne University in Australia. And Amir is the head of the Social Data Analytics, SODA, which is a great acronym, lab in the Social Innovation Research Institute. The lab applies contemporary and emerging co-op data analytics techniques to provide insight into health and social problems. And Amir also used to work for the Australian Research Data Commons some time ago. Okay, thanks, Amir, and go ahead, please.
Thanks, Stephanie. Yes, as you said, this project almost relates to my previous life as in Australian Research Data Common, but also maybe I'll tell you as part of the story of the working group, but we actually have transformed to be one of the adopters of the outcome of this. So I think that might have worked quite well. So the group, the Data Description Registry Interoperability Working Group, this group actually was created as one of the earlier groups in the, oh, hang on a minute. What happened? Okay, yeah. This group was actually created as one of the earlier groups in the RDA, and for that it has actually interesting structure to it. We had an active partnership from a number of different organizations in the beginning, and we got together in the early days of the RDA with the goal of finding a better way for connecting data sets across the repositories. So the idea at the time was there must be a better way for finding data than just keyword search, and this was often related, it was a problem or issue related to the repository pages when you're looking at a data set and you're wondering, well, is there any other data set that can be related to this that I can use as part of my research? So the idea at the time, or the hypothesis, if you like, was, well, we know there is a data citation, but not exactly. The data citation is not still in full implementation, but there must be ways to actually connect these metadata records or the data description records. And as part of this, what we did, we started to test a model to say, well, if we try to actually find information about data sets, one of the core elements that we can actually search for are the authors for those data sets. So let's you go for a data description record like this in Research Data Australia. We can search the name of the author or creator or data custodian. You will find that person in Google. You go to the landing page for that person. In this case, is a Professor Catherine Bilov in University of Sydney. You go to the list of all the publications and works by this researcher. And if you read all of those, in the middle of some of those articles, you will find links to other data sets. So in this case, there is another data set in the Dryad repository. Now, if you go to that page, you will find another data set by the same author. So technically, we have went from a data set to a researcher to a publication, and publication to the data set. And the hypothesis behind this was these data sets that are linked through this chain of connections are more related than just abstract keyword search in the search engines. Now, we have done this study at a time, and our result was quite promising. It showed that you can find a lot of related data sets. Some of them is following the earlier presentation from Jan, come back to the actual data versioning. So sometimes you will see the same data set published in different places, but a lot of times is actually evolved version of that data set, the augmented version of that data set, or even there are different data sets that are created by the same group. Now, at the time, the output of the working group was a recommendation that we have published, but also it was actual open source code. So we created a code in GitHub that called Research Data Switchboard, and it was basically implementing that methodology. And as I said, it's come back to the kind of motivation or philosophy behind the working group. It was a list of organizations who they really wanted to answer or a solution that works for them. So we had a source code that code had a capability of reading information from a whole bunch of different sources, create a graph. It has integration and connections to the main identifier providers like Crossref, DataCite. It has an integration with the Google Search API, and it builds a graph out of this. That is the graph that later on we call it a research graph. Now, the kind of center point of this graph is a data set, and it links the data set to researchers, grants, and publications. And through those links, it starts to build the connectivity across the network. Now, these are some of the examples of how the data sets could be linked in this space. Like you can have two data sets that are cited by the same paper. You can have two data sets that are cited by the same grant, or they are mentioned in the grant proposal, or they actually have the acknowledgement to that grant. And you can have two data sets that are basically either created by the same researchers or that researchers in the list of contributors to that data set. Now, the research graph was another kind of outcome of the working group. So once we had the code, we started running the code across the multiple different repositories. We realized that we started to build graphs, and those graphs are getting bigger and bigger. And we very soon we got to the kind of good problem of the big data, and we had to actually manage a distributed graph across multiple sources. Now, the graph has evolved across multiple different nodes at the moment in Europe, US, and Australia. And it includes both public metadata from the Crossref and data site and ORCID to some private data metadata records from the research organizations. At the time to make this available for a lot of research purposes, we actually published an open version of this in the scientific data journal from Nature, with all the descriptions of how the data has been created and curated. And after that, we also have some of the other updated version of this data set. So this has been one of the sources that has contributed to the community in this space. Now, talking about organizations who have been involved from the beginning and have adopted some of the outcome of this technology, one of them is the NCI, National Computation Infrastructure in Australia. NCI has been involved from the early days of the project and has adopted this for finding the richer metadata about the data sets that are stored on the NCI nodes. Now, the way that they use it is, for example, this is one of the NCI data sets, and you can see Peter Oak as one of the researchers who have contributed to this data set. Now, after creating the graph and making all of this connection in place, NCI could see the connection from the NCI record about Peter Oak and those data sets to the Peter Oak ORCID profile and all the publications connected to that. And then through another connections into this research graph ecosystem enabled by the switchboard, we could see connections to the SCOLEX datasets, which is another working group and outcome and output from the Research Data Alliance. And there we actually made a connection from a dataset to researchers to ORCID to publication, and publications to another dataset. And this chain of connections can actually continue. This is what we call degrees of separation, and we call this process in general, we call them augmentation of their records. Now, this is actual NCI dataset. After the augmentation, the data goes from the GeoNetwork to a graph database, goes into the research graph kind of environment using the switchboard code, and it produced a bigger graph, which is, again, we call this one augmented graph. And the graph basically shows a list between the connections across researchers, data sets, and publications. Now, this is a difference between the augmented graph and pre-augmented graph. So what you see on the left is an NCI original graph that shows that the orange spots are the data sets that are linked to the publications are blue, and the greens are researchers. And after augmentations, basically the research graph has completed the kind of missing pieces in this. Mentioning the other organizations who have adopted this work in different formats. So NII from Japan has been involved from early days and did some work with the Research Data Switchboard. GASES from Germany has been quite active in the project. Dora Space and Vivo, and we built a link to that environment, to the Vivo space. The Research Data Australia, NCI from Australia, and also a number of Australian universities, including Swinburne, RMIT, ANU, and Sydney, to different degrees have used this integration in different products and platforms. And one of the things that we have started to do and we found quite fruitful is that partnership with universities toward building knowledge graph for different projects. We found that the corpus of these links are quite insightful when you want to find patterns related to the specific activities. Like one of the projects right now we are kind of working on that space is looking at the impact of COVID-19 and finding out all the literatures and publications in that space and how COVID-19 actually changed the landscape of research. Projects like this can be enabled using this technology. One of the also upcoming projects, this is my last slide on this topic. This is a project we're building with the partnership of 5 universities with the aim of finding the more kind of efficient way to go into the corpus of the literature and gray literature and find the related information to a given question. And this is kind of like the next phase, top of those connections. Now you have all of those connections, and you can actually mine them from the graph. We go to the inside body of those links, and we basically create the information graph that it is really matching to the topic. Like I'll give you a specific example. If you're looking at the mental health research, you are interested in topics related to that. So you want to know the family violence, you want to know crime, poverty, social services, loneliness. All of those are topics that are related to the mental health context. And if you do that research in a given area, like let's say, for example, Victoria in Australia, you want to know only data sets and publications and information, policy documents that are referencing that geospatial area. So this is actually filtering those results based on the spatial filtering. Now, this is again another example of the outcome of the working group, this journey that the working group took from a concept document to implementations to partnerships. I think given the interest of time, that's probably my last slide. I think I probably should open this for question and answer. If there are any interest or questions, you can always contact me on the email below, Amir Aryani, that is under the slide. Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Amir. Again, if you have questions, please type them into the questions box. We have one. What additional criteria or properties did you use for augmenting the graph in addition to ORCID? Did you also consider mapping between controlled vocabularies, correspondences?
Yes, so not in the body of the research graph. The research graph is a link of 2 types of connections. There are connections that we call them authority links. These are the data connections that come from some source. Let's say, for example, a national library has a connection between the book and the author. In a data site, we have a link between a data set and a publication. So there is an authority source that says that 2 things are linked. So the research graph has a whole corpus of those links established. So it's not just ORCID. There are about, I think last time I checked, I don't have exact number, but there are more than 10 different types of connections in that space. The other category of connections in this space that we have explored is, we call them AI-driven links, but really there are applied different methods of data mining for find connections. So control vocabulary, events, finding things like a topic modeling, clustering the articles and groups based on their properties. We have tried all sorts of different links, and we actually have those links with a probabilistic link, if you're familiar with that concept that's called confidence level. So there's a confidence level that shows 2 different things are linked. However, lots of those links lead to interesting visualization outcomes, but not necessarily very productive outputs for the researchers, because you would get so many false positives. I don't know if actually I've answered your question exactly, but if it is not clear enough, maybe after the webinars, we can actually have a chat about that.
Okay, thanks very much, Amir. Any further questions for Amir? Okay, nothing coming in so far. Again, if you have questions for any of our speakers later on, you can either contact the speakers directly or you can email the RDA Secretariat at inquiries@rdalliance.org. Okay, I shall just go and make myself presenter and go through another couple of slides. Okay. So just a couple of small things at the end. You may know about the recommendations and outputs catalog. We have RDA outputs classified as recommendations, supporting outputs are other outputs, and you can search for those according to their status, the data lifecycle area, and the scientific domain. You can find the link to the catalog at the bottom of this slide. If you have adopted an RDA output, we would really love to hear from you. RDA is actively seeking new adoption stories to inspire the further uptake of RDA outputs. If you have a story, you can submit it at the link on the slide, or you can, again, just email the Secretariat, and the contact details will be on the last slide again. Finally, the CoData Data Science Journal currently has a call for papers open, which has a deadline of the 17th of July. This is a special collection for results produced by an RDA interest or working group of an adoption case or other types of work related to RDA activities. And RDA Europe for the RDA Europe project still has funds available to pay for the article processing charges. And if you want to submit something, please talk to us before the 17th of July. This call for papers is open to all interested applicants. That's not just for Europeans, it's for people anywhere. And finally, please, if you have any questions, suggestions, would like to ask questions of the speakers or any other reason, please get in touch with us and we'll be happy to respond to you and put you in touch with the speakers. So I would like to thank our speakers. Thank you very much, Jens, Andrea, Helene, Lauren, and Amir. And thank you all for attending this webinar. Hopefully you found it informative. And as mentioned at the start, the link to the webinar recording and slides will be posted to the RDA website in the next day or so, might be 2 days. And we'll also be sure to send you the link by email. Again, thank you very much for attending and have a great rest of the day or evening, wherever you are. Thank you very much. And I shall end the webinar now.